What's up, everyone? It's your guy coming at you live and direct. Today, we are breaking down something that most mainstream media outlets are either missing or deliberately soft pedaling. China just dropped a 5-part counterstrike against the United States. And let me tell you, this is not your grandfather's trade war. Now, if you just skim the headlines like most people, you probably thought, oh great, more tariffs, same old, nothing to see here, but I'm telling you right now. And I want you to really sit with this. This time is completely, fundamentally different. On the surface, they didn't touch a single price tag. They didn't announce any flashy percentage hikes. But underneath the hood, they just made American businesses feel suffocated right at the very roots of their global supply chains. And that, my friends, is way more vicious, way more surgical, and way more dangerous than any plain tariff hike you could dream up. Let's start from the beginning and lay out the full picture. Recently, and by recently I mean in the last couple of weeks, the US government once again waving that well-worn national security flag like it's the only tool in the toolbox, started making aggressive moves to restrict Chinese hardware related to data centers. This isn't new behavior from Washington, but the scope is getting ridiculous. At the end of July, specifically July 31st, they shoved another 43 Chinese companies onto the entity list. That's the blacklist that effectively cuts them off from US technology and components. And get this, they even went after a freaking sunflower seed distributor. I'm dead serious, a company that sells sunflower seeds. I mean, come on. What does that have to do with protecting America from any conceivable threat? It's become a joke, but it's not funny anymore because it shows they're just throwing spaghetti at the wall. Then on August 4th, Reuters, which is generally a reliable source, leaked that Washington is now drafting a brand new ban that would stop imports of Chinese-made optical modules specifically designed for data centers. And guess what? The justification is. Same 4 words, national security. It's become their default answer for everything. But here's the critical context that most people don't understand with global AI demand absolutely exploding this year. I am talking about the ChatGPT effect. The massive build-out of training clusters, the hyperscalers throwing billions at infrastructure. Optical modules are the literal backbone of any modern data center. You can't have high-speed data transmission without them. They are the nervous system of the entire AI economy. So when Washington moves to block Chinese optical modules, this isn't about security. It's about squeezing China's throat where it actually hurts, right in the middle of the AI gold rush. Now, in the past, China's playbook was predictable. They would issue a strongly worded statement, call a press conference, and spend weeks explaining why the US was being unreasonable. They would essentially play defense, trying to convince the world they weren't a threat. Not this time, not even close. This time, Beijing didn't just stand there and preach facts and logic like they used to. Nope, they rolled up their sleeves, cracked their knuckles. And on August 5th, yesterday, as I'm recording this, the Ministry of Commerce, citing the foreign trade law as their legal hammer, dropped not 1, not 2, but 5 countermeasures in one single coordinated blast. It was a coordinated salvo designed to maximize shock value. Let me run through all 5 of them in detail, because each one matters. Number 1, tighten export controls on drones and drone-related components. This isn't just a minor tweak. It's a serious restriction that affects the entire unmanned aerial vehicle ecosystem. Number 2, suspend U.S. certification agencies from doing factory follow-up inspections for China's 3C products. That's their mandatory certification regime for electronics sold in the Chinese market. Number 3, blacklist one American compliance testing company. That's right, a specific U.S. firm is now persona non grata in China. Number 4, launch a full-blown national security review on imported printing and copying equipment. And I don't mean just a cursory glance. This is a deep dive investigation that could lead to serious restrictions. Number 5, sanction 6 entities linked to Xinjiang. These are organizations that have been involved in various supply chain monitoring and certification activities. Now, at first glance, these 5 points seem totally random and disconnected, right? I mean, what do drones have to do with copiers? What does a testing company have to do with Xinjiang? But if you actually sit down and connect the dots, and this is where the real genius of their strategy comes into play. Every single one of these is a surgical strike planted right at the joints of the American hardware supply chain. They're not messing with prices at all. They're blocking the actual entry points for tons of US goods coming into China. And they're making compliance costs and trial and error expenses skyrocket overnight. It's like they studied the US supply chain for years and found every single weak spot. Let's start with drones, because this is where the numbers really tell the story. According to the latest U.S. Customs and Border Protection data, combined with industry trade statistics. And I've gone through the numbers carefully. As of yesterday's full tally, America imported about 56,000 drones throughout all of 2025. That's the total number of units that cross the border. The declared direct value of those imports, only $260 million. Now, I've seen people online laughing at that number, saying it's pocket change, barely a rounding error in the overall bilateral trade that runs into the hundreds of billions. And on the surface, they're not wrong about the percentage, but those people are only reading the receipt, not the blueprint. They have zero clue about the real weak spot deeper in the supply chain. And that's where the danger actually lies. Sure, the United States has its own drone manufacturers. Companies like Skydio and others are trying to build a domestic industry. And just last month, the Pentagon and Commerce Department doubled down on restricting foreign procurement of drone components. But here's the ugly truth that nobody in Washington wants to admit. The most critical parts inside any American-made drone, the batteries that power them, the flight control systems that keep them in the air, and those tiny printed circuit boards that connect everything together, still depend on Chinese supply chains for over 90% of their content. That's not a dependency, that's a straight-up addiction. So now that China has tightened export controls on these components, this isn't about prices going up a little bit. This isn't about finding a slightly more expensive supplier. This is about not having enough components to even finish a single unit. Production lines freeze, workers stand around, delivery dates get pushed back indefinitely. That's the real impact. And it's devastating. Now let's shift gears and talk about that certification move, because this one is especially clever and shows they've been paying attention to our own tactics. Back in April of this year, the U.S. Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, pushed through a proposal that directly bans Chinese testing labs from participating in the testing and certification process for electronic devices that are exported to the United States. The reason for this, you guessed it, national security. They claimed that Chinese labs couldn't be trusted to certify the safety and compliance of products coming into America. It was a thinly veiled protectionist measure dressed up in security language. So what did China do this time? They gave us a taste of our own medicine, but with a distinctly Chinese flavor. They suspended American agencies from doing factory follow-up inspections for 3C products. Those are the consumer electronics that are sold in the Chinese market. That is a direct one-to-one reciprocal response. You don't trust my labs. Fine. Then I have every valid reason to keep your inspectors from setting foot in my factories and poking around my production lines. It's a perfect mirror move, and it's perfectly legal under their domestic regulations. And the impact here is massive. The compliance channels that a huge volume of American hardware needs to enter China are now hanging by a thread. Sure. In theory, companies can try to rebuild their certification pathways from scratch. They can find new agencies, establish new protocols, and redo all the paperwork. But in the real business world, where time is money and speed is everything, that process takes at least 3 to 6 extra months of work, legal fees, and bureaucratic headaches, and for smart hardware, consumer electronics, or enterprise gear. A 6-month delay is a death sentence. It means your competitors have already launched their next generation products, grabbed your market share, and locked in your customers. That hidden time tax that China just imposed hurts way more than any tariff you could write on a bill. It's invisible, but it's devastating. Next up, let's dig into the investigation into printing and copying equipment, because this one looks like a head scratcher at first, but is actually a masterstroke. According to earlier trade data from multiple sources, in 2023, China imported about $5.51 billion worth of printing machinery and parts. That's a huge market. Out of that total, direct imports from the United States were only $141 million. That's barely 2.56% of the total. So some people look at that and ask, if direct imports are that small, why make such a big fuss about investigating them? What's the point? You have to read the Ministry of Commerce's announcement very carefully, because there's one sentence that's absolutely critical, and it's easy to miss if you're not paying attention. They're investigating imported equipment that contains foreign software. Not just the hardware, the software, and here's the thing that most people don't understand about modern office equipment. Today's copiers and printers aren't the old black and white paper pushers from the 1990s. They've got big hard drives that store every document they've ever processed. They've got motherboards with real processing power. They've got operating systems that run just like a computer. and they're often directly connected to internal corporate networks, which means they can send and receive data across the entire company. Essentially, they're data processing terminals sitting right in your office, quietly archiving everything that goes through them. So even if the whole machine says made in Japan on the label or made in Korea, or even if it's assembled in China from a global parts bin, as long as the underlying system runs on American software or US-made driver chips, it falls under this compliance warning. And that means the review applies to thousands of models that aren't even directly imported from the United States. This isn't about the direct trade volume at all. It's about taking down the entire ecosystem of American software and chip design that sits inside these machines. It's a giant warning shot across the bow of the entire US technology stack, not just the final assembly line. And right on cue, as these 5 measures continue to sink in and the market digests the implications. Today, Wall Street opened with noticeable tremors. I'm not exaggerating. Some major hardware companies that rely heavily on global supply chains, along with certification-related stocks and compliance consulting firms, started swinging wildly. The latest financial news is already reporting that several Silicon Valley giants are urgently assessing their new compliance costs in emergency meetings right now because capital absolutely hates uncertainty. And now the market has a brand new risk factor to price in China access compliance. Investors are asking questions nobody has clear answers to yet. And that's when the panic starts. Now, a lot of you are probably sitting there thinking, if they want to hit back so badly, why not just slap on another few $100 billion in tariffs like they've done before? That would look more dramatic and decisive, right? It would make headlines and satisfy the home crowd, but you've got to understand the fundamental difference here. Tariffs are ultimately just a price tool. They're a tax on goods crossing the border. When you add a tariff, companies don't just absorb it, they raise their prices, pass the cost along to the consumer, and in the end, you and I pay for it at the register. As long as there's still profit margin to be made, businesses will suck it up, shift production to Vietnam or Mexico or India, and keep rolling with their operations. It's annoying, but it's survivable. And the data proves this. From 2018 through all the tariff wars up to now, we've seen endless rounds of taxes, with amounts hitting hundreds of billions of dollars across thousands of product categories. Yet if you look at 2025, just last year, bilateral goods trade between the United States and China still held steady at over $411 billion. In yuan terms, that's roughly 40 trillion. That's not a collapse. That's resilience. What does that tell you? It tells you that simple tariffs cannot cut the deep economic ties between two major powers when the underlying demand is that massive. As long as American consumers want Chinese products and Chinese companies need American technology, price tools alone won't stop the deals from happening. But this 5-part counterstrike is a whole different animal. We're not talking about price signals anymore. We're talking about physical barriers. Security reviews and compliance certifications are the equivalent of locking the doors and throwing away the key. Once a product fails a review or can't get the required certification from the right agencies, the door locks shut. It doesn't matter how cheap you sell it. It doesn't matter how much profit you're willing to forgo. Even if you give it away for free, it's not getting into the Chinese market legally. Your market share faces outright zero risk. From $100 million to zero in one regulatory decision, that kind of non-tariff wall is far more lethal than any tax because there's no price signal to adjust, no margin to squeeze. It's just no entry, period. And let's get into the actual sanctioned entities this time, because this part is particularly interesting and shows a level of strategic sophistication that many people are missing. They targeted groups like the Responsible Business Alliance. And let me be honest, a lot of Americans have probably never heard of this organization. It doesn't make headlines in the US press, but trust me, it's a big deal in the global supply chain world. According to their latest data through mid-2026, the Alliance has over 600 member companies. These aren't small players. They're the biggest names in tech, automotive, aerospace, and consumer goods. Their combined annual revenue exceeds $8 trillion. That's more than the GDP of most countries. And they directly employ more than 215 million people worldwide. That includes a huge number of top-tier global hardware and supply chain giants that you've definitely heard of. Intel, HP, Dell, and many others. By going straight for the alliance itself, rather than picking off individual companies, Beijing is sending a message that is loud and crystal clear, no matter how massive you are. If you play along with certain unreasonable restrictions and politically motivated reviews, you can kiss the Chinese market goodbye. Don't even think about it. It's a blanket warning that applies to every single member of that alliance, and it creates a chilling effect that goes far beyond the companies directly named in the sanctions. And just today, literally today, independent think tanks in London and Toronto released new reports that are getting circulated in policy circles. They're stating pretty plainly that China is no longer sticking to simple tariff tactics like they did in the Trump and early Biden years. Instead, they're now skillfully using non-tariff barriers and compliance access tools on a fully reciprocal basis. This marks a genuine shift toward modernized, precision-based economic countermeasures. In plain English, they're getting better and better at using the very rulebook that we wrote ourselves when we created the global trade system. And they're legally and legitimately grabbing the upper hand using our own playbook that stings, because we can't complain about it without looking like hypocrites. Now, if we dig even deeper, and really get under the hood, the long-term significance of these 5 measures really comes down to one word: demystification. Let me explain what I mean by that. For the past few decades, haven't we all just assumed that when the US government cries national security, that's the final word? That's the conversation stopper. Washington got used to dressing up its domestic laws as global rules reaching across borders with all that long-arm jurisdiction. The Helms-Burton Act, the various export control regulations, the sanctions on Iran and North Korea, and anyone else they didn't like. It became almost a reflex. Just a few days ago, on July 31st, the US added more than 40 Chinese companies to the entity list, again including that absurd sunflower seed seller. It's plainly ridiculous on its face. It cheapens the whole concept of national security when you apply it to agricultural products. Then on August 4th, they leaked the optical module ban. It's one thing after another, and the cumulative effect is that national security has become a joke. In the past, China's default response to this kind of treatment was to state facts and reason. They would hold press conferences, produce white papers, and try to convince the world that they weren't a threat. They played defense. They explained themselves. But that logic has completely flipped. Now, if the US can unilaterally declare that Chinese optical modules have backdoor risks without producing any evidence, then by the same principle, China has just as much justification to believe that imported printers and copiers loaded with American operating systems and storing massive internal data also pose data leak dangers. It's the exact same standard. If we're going to use potential risk as the threshold, then everything is a potential risk. And pay close attention to the legal framing here. China is conducting this investigation strictly under Article 41 of its foreign trade law, which is a duly enacted domestic statute. They're not making up new rules on the fly. They're using existing law. They are fully within their own domestic legal framework. Exercising a sovereign right to national security reviews that every country on earth claims for itself, they've gone from passively explaining why they're not a threat to actively stepping up and defining what constitutes a threat to them, using the same kind of language and the same legal approaches that we've been using for years. That is a fundamental reversal in the underlying power game. China is no longer the defendant in the International Trade Court. They're now the plaintiff, the judge, and the jury all at once. And it's making Washington extremely uncomfortable because as of today, not a single politician or mainstream media talking head can point to any violation of international law. There's simply no legal hook to hang a complaint on. They can't call it illegal because it's not. They can't call it unfair because it's reciprocal. They're stuck. And that's exactly the position China wants them in. So over the long run, can American companies actually hold up under this kind of pressure? I've been asking this question to industry contacts, and the answers aren't encouraging. In the short term, they might manage by burning through inventory, using existing stockpiles, and relying on products that were already cleared through customs before the new rules took effect. That gives them a buffer, maybe 6 months, maybe a year for some components, but in the long term, they're staring down a completely unsolvable decoupling paradox. And I want you to really think about this paradox because it's the key to understanding why this whole strategy actually hurts us more than it hurts them. What's that paradox? It's that Washington politicians keep shouting cut off China, decouple, de-risk from every podium in DC, while Silicon Valley tech giants know deep down that they desperately need China's efficient and cost-effective supply chain to stay on top globally. They can't have it both ways. The politicians want to look tough on China, but the engineers and procurement officers know that there are no easy replacements for Chinese manufacturing capabilities. Take the hottest sector right now, artificial intelligence, according to the latest industry tracking news that I've been following. With optical modules and other AI-related hardware now facing potential restrictions, Meta, Google, Amazon, and other top hyperscalers are already doing internal emergency assessments. And what are they assessing? Whether their planned data center expansion projects for 2026 and 2027 are now at serious risk of major delivery delays. These are billion-dollar projects that are the foundation of their next-generation AI services. Delays don't just mean missed deadlines. They mean lost competitive advantage, lost market share, and lost shareholder value. Even US-based groups like the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, which is generally pro-American competitiveness, have admitted in recent reports that in critical areas like optical communications, high-density circuit boards, micromotors, and other components that sound minor but are absolutely vital to AI infrastructure, domestic production capacity is expanding way too slowly to keep up with exploding market demand. We simply don't have the factories, the skilled labor, or the supply chains to replace China. If they force Chinese suppliers out now, the resulting costs and timeline extensions are simply beyond what American manufacturing can absorb. We're talking about years of delay, not months. And in the tech world, years mean obsolescence, when political correctness crashes head-on into real business interests. That internal fracture and self-inflicted damage is what US companies really can't handle. They're caught between a rock and a hard place, and there's no easy way out. And here's the part that makes this even more fascinating. Industry insiders have already noticed a key detail that the mainstream media hasn't picked up on. In this 5-part counterstrike, China didn't even mention the strategic core minerals where they have absolute pricing power and overwhelming global market share. I'm talking about rare earths, gallium, germanium, graphite, and other critical materials that are essential for everything from semiconductors to batteries to advanced optics. Not a single word, they left all of those cards face down on the table. Now, why is that significant? Because it shows they're deliberately holding back their biggest guns. They don't need to play every card at once. That kind of hidden in plain sight posture is actually the biggest strategic deterrent of all. Keeping those cards face down and not rushing to play them keeps the other side constantly guessing, always wondering when the next shoe will drop. Every day that goes by without a restriction on rare earths is a day of anxiety for procurement officers in American factories. Are they going to be able to source materials next quarter, next year? The uncertainty alone is crippling for long-term US investment confidence. That continuous psychological pressure is the most effective weapon of all. It's not about what they did yesterday, it's about what they might do tomorrow. And that uncertainty, that constant fear of escalation, is exactly what they want to create. All right? That is the full, unvarnished, no BS breakdown of what just happened. No skipping, no sugarcoating, no pretending this is business as usual. This is the hard reality of how the game has fundamentally changed. And we need to wake up to it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear what you think about these 5 measures and whether you think American companies are ready for this new reality. And as always, I'll catch you all in the next one. Peace.